So welcome to the second session of Dan's Data Office Hours. Glad you're all here. I spent the past week at Data Council in Austin and learned a ton that I'll share a little bit later today. But the flip side is that I haven't really had a chance to tweak the tech setup, which is why we saw some of the difficulties earlier. So I'm still using Zoom to do the initial stream, and then I'm broadcasting to LinkedIn. So I'm live streaming to LinkedIn. So this time, hopefully, I'll do a better job monitoring the questions, especially on LinkedIn, and I hope not to miss any. So if you want to ask questions, actually, I prefer if you join the Zoom because the Zoom link is on the invite and you'll be able to, I'll be able to respond to it just much more, much quicker and much more timely. And you could also feel free to vocalize it and say something live. Okay. So without further ado, I thought I'd run through some of the questions that we didn't get to last time. And there were three questions that I'll jump into. One, the first one came from Jeff Skolberg, and he asked, what are your thoughts on the future of data engineering, given one, AI, and two, tool proliferation? And there are so many tools, nothing is standard anymore. For sure, I'm seeing it, and it's a great question. AI is everyone, everyone's been talking about it and really completely changing a ton of different industries. But the reality is it's unevenly distributed, and there's a pretty big echo chamber, especially in the startup community and people that are into the data space, and they think every other company is as modern as they are. Like as an example, I met someone earlier this week who works at a Fortune 500 company, and their big project right now is moving from Teradata to Databricks, right? And I think if you talk to smaller companies, they may not even know what Teradata is in the first place. So that's one thing. Another thought here is that there does seem to be a spectrum sort of tools developing. So one example is there's these tools called that consider themselves these full stack or data platforms that try to do everything. They'll try to handle deploying your data warehouse. They will also pull in data from third parties. Think of like ETL, some like a Fivetran does, but they embed it. Either they will sort of white label Fivetran, or they'll host it themselves, or they'll let you pick and choose it, or they'll configure it. But they'll try to package it all together. And the companies there are something akin to like a coalesce.io or I think a Y42, a 5x.co. There's a few companies there that are trying to be these one-stop shop for data. And on the flip side, you have like everything sort of either proprietary tools, where you will pick your own sort of vertical slice of the modern data stack, or even beyond that, you could choose within each of those, you could also choose like a closed source or open source version. So for example, lately Snowflake has been in the news by releasing or having support for Iceberg, right? So Iceberg is an open source format that allows you to store files on S3, but still use Snowflake to read the files, run all the computation, and then write the output right back to S3. So you're not paying Snowflake for storage, and you're keeping the data open, and you're using Snowflake purely as this idea of running SQL queries or doing some computations on the data. So there's like a whole spectrum there. Um, and then I think, yeah, so I guess the other item I thought about here that I note down is maybe one way of thinking about it is akin to Apple, right? Like how Apple has a pretty tight ecosystem, but they provide such great integration among the computer and the watch and the phone that you don't really have an incentive to leave, and you realize there's a trade-off here, but you're willing to embrace sort of the limitation because everything just works. So maybe we'll end up sort of in this world where there'll be these pockets of tools that all work well together, and you'll have experts in those. And on the flip side, maybe for some people that will want to pick and choose, and there'll be a whole other ecosystem that works nicely in this open fashion. So the other, going back to the original question, right, around what will the future hold here? I imagine, this is my gut, is people always really still need to have a good mental model of the data flows, but they will probably become specialists in specific tools. I think it's just very hard unless there's a lot of companies sort of merging or combining for one person to just be an expert at everything. The analogy I have here is I used to use Sublime Text as my text editor, and then VS Code came out, and everyone's like, "Hey, Dan, you should use VS Code." And I started using it, and I was definitely unproductive at first, but I stuck with it. And you figure out the shortcuts, the extensions, the way to use it, and then maybe like a week later, 2 weeks later, a month later, It's like, hey, I'm actually much better and much more productive in VS Code than I was in Sublime Text. So I think it's the same thing here, right? If every time you it's like there's this value and comfort in what you know, and every time you learn something new, like there will be this decline in productivity and decline in value, and at some point, if you commit to it and you like stick with it, you'll be able to increase it again. And I just don't know what, like, how many people have the patience, sort of to do that, or like even the ability, right, to do it. So maybe we'll have some people specialize in Tableau, someone else specializes in Looker, someone else specializes in like Hashboard. And I suspect maybe we'll end up, and obviously people could like pick and choose, but I do suspect there'll be sort of clusters of tools that work well together, and we'll have different specialists in their case. The joke part here is like kind of how AI fits in. Maybe none of this matters anyway, and we'll up in this world where AI does everything for us, and why bother, spending any time thinking about it? So that was question one. Thank you, Jeff. Another question I got from Adil, which is, what do you think about Kimball data model versus one big table? And as always, it depends. A lot of people try to say, X is better than Y always. And every time someone tries to deal with absolutes, the reality is it depends, even if having a very black and white view sells and sort of gets a reaction. Um, like my general preference or my general thought here is that one big table, I think, feels a little bit cleaner, but it just doesn't scale as nicely as, like, neither with the data nor with the complexity of a modern business. And most companies will evolve to use a solution that's more like Kimball, and some even start out, at the beginning that way. Like I just think it's a better way of sort of modeling like what the business cares about. And at the end of the day, the point of data and reporting analytics is to support the business. And maybe there's also this element of having both, right? You have this like one big table, let's say, to collect all of your events, and then at some point you do a variety of transformations to create more of these like Kimball sort of inspired fact tables. And then the probably like taking this question a bit further, and inspired a bit by my sort of conversations at Data Council, there was a great talk about how the AI data stack is just very different from the modern data stack. And there were like two big items there that resonated with me. One was how the world of AI data is suddenly introduced unstructured data. So it's like even beyond, Kimball or one big table is just like images and text and conversations and audio. That's one thing. And then two, just the sheer scale and something. I think the speaker, she mentioned that the amount of unstructured data that it uses like 20 times bigger than the amount of structured data we have. Or like rather 95% is going to be unstructured, 5% is going to be structured, and we're going to need a whole new set of tools to dealing with it. Right? Because you can imagine why. It's going to be slower to parse, it's going to be obviously much more expensive. And like that's going to introduce a whole new way of thinking about like data modeling. Although, I mean, at the end of the day, I suspect we'll at some point still need to sort of like collapse and compress it to actually make it accessible. So good question. And the last question I got from Brian was, so what's surprising to you about how businesses manage their data? So, and I think the takeaway I had here was just how varied the approaches really are. So some of it for sure is a function of company size, right? If a company is very small, they may have everything in MySQL or some relational, or even like Excel. And as a company gets larger, or even like a government entity, like the data is everywhere across dozens of different databases, dozens of different systems. None of them talk together. So there's just like a very wide spectrum here. Um, and then I think this does also go back to this idea of an echo chamber, like where we're all so used to talking about data, living in data, like trying out every new open source tool, that we don't realize that real companies like are much further behind. And I think that leads to the other point that I think at every company, or almost every company, like data is just underutilized, right? Just so much data being captured, but it still feels that we're using it too reactively versus, actually using it to change direction of a business, right? Like one framing, and I forgot who said it, but I kind of liked it, is initially you will have a lot of data being used, to prove an existing business point. Someone asks for a report, for a dashboard, they look at it, and it kind of validates their point of view. And if it invalidates it, people come up with an excuse, like, why was the data wrong? Or did you do this? Or did you slice it this way? And I really like like I forgot who said it, but the framing was more of let's say you have a data, like a model of the world, and then you're using the data sort of insights to influence your sort of worldview or your role model. And I kind of liked that framing where you're using data as sort of really like akin to like qualitative information, right? Where like a conversation with a customer forces you to think about your business differently. And I kind of like thinking about data that way. And I don't know how many companies, like if any, are doing that right now. And then the yeah, and then the other item, sort of obviously I had time to think about these questions, but the other theme I had here is that data engineers are starting to be embedded into the business teams. So one example here is I spoke with someone who was actually a data engineer, but part of the marketing team. And then, I spoke with him, and it makes a ton of sense. Like the marketing right now is so quantitative, they have to pull in data from so many different sources. Some of it's internal, like CRM tools, but some of it's external, like Google Analytics data. And they do need, and each company has their um, has their tool set up a bit differently. So you need someone that's pretty technical to take all that data in, join it together, merge it together in order to make sense of it. And I suspect we'll see this becoming more and more popular over the years, where maybe you'll have a centralized data platform team, akin to maybe the analogy here is similar to how AWS provides, cloud capabilities to data teams. Like data teams will provide data capabilities to other teams within the organization, and then each team or unit within the organization will have their own specialized data engineers that are, leveraging either products that the data platform team built or using some of these like third-party tools, but really, really aligned with the business goals rather than thinking about data sort of in a reactive way. So I see Isaac dropped a question, so I'll read it for those on LinkedIn. So Isaac asks, do you know which AI large language models are fluent enough in SQL to auto-migrate from data warehouses to data lake, convert between SQL dialects, make SQL used across enterprise more standardized, reports, BI tools, DDLs, and better modeled? Um, it's a good question. I don't like, I know there's a pretty big move called like NL to SQL, and quite a lot of academic papers written about it. How do you translate like natural language to SQL and then write sort of queries? And I think the latest state of the art, you can look at the papers, it might be like, I don't know, 30% accurate by default. And if you add sort of more of context, describing the fields and the tables and how they fit together, maybe you get to like 60% accuracy. So we're pretty far from there. But I think your specific question around like sort of migrating data from like one dialect to another is much easier. There's a tool that I'm actually using at my company called SQLglot. So if you search for SQLglot, and it's built by a company called Tobiko that has SQL Mesh, which is a way of defining jobs and table relationships, and then it'll sort of manage it very much like dbt, but I would say more like thoughtful modern way. But they have an open source library called SQLglot that will parse, any dialect that they support, and I think they support about 24 right now, into an abstract representation in basically like an AST, like a syntax tree. And then they'll also let you translate it into another dialect. So, you could go from Postgres to DuckDB, you go from Snowflake to Spark SQL. And so I think there are tools like that, but I think the fundamental challenge there is that not all like there's not a perfect mapping between some functions. Like sometimes it really is the same thing, right? Like maybe, the functions just name something differently, date versus datetime or date versus YMZ. But oftentimes the function just may not exist in another dialect. And that's probably going to be the challenge here, where maybe like, I don't know, 80, 90% could be translated, but then you're still going to need to run both in parallel and compare the results across both. Uh, So yeah, and I think your last question, right, makes SQL used across enterprises more standardized. So one way like something I've been spending a bunch of time thinking about this, and the belief I've sort of developed is that you want to do a lot of like almost everything you want to do as upstream as possible, meaning like as early as possible. So in this case, like you're talking about like making BI more standardized. One way of doing it is by trying to make the BI a very thin layer and saying, like right now, a lot of BI tools will ask you to define metrics. How do I calculate churn? How do I calculate retention? And I think the right way of thinking about it is like, don't do it in the BI tool, do it earlier. Let's say even like the data model. So your tables already have those definitions as much as possible. And of course, not every metric could be done that way, right? Because if you're doing a percentage, you can't, and you can just add up percentages because then you'll end up with something like, let's say, over 100%. But trying to keep as much upstream as possible so then the actual calculation becomes very simple. I think that's one way of, I would say, like just not being making it easy for yourself to give yourself that optionality to switch across different tools. But on the flip side, like a lot of tools realize it, right? That they want, like they don't necessarily want to do what's best for you, but instead they want to do what's best for them. And that's often, making it lock in and making it hard to switch, increasing switching costs. So I think that's something as an industry we have to sort of, I don't know, fight against or balance. I don't know, did that help, Isaac? Give you a sense of at least how I think about it? Oh, yes, Isaac responds for those on LinkedIn. Yes, I agree. For upstream, most tools pass their SQL back to the source. It's just too hard to read, proprietary, etc. Yeah, like I do think like some other theme that came up like some in this like in the data council this conversation like is SQL a commodity, right? The intuition there is if you look at, and I think this goes back to the previous point I mentioned about Iceberg, where now that storage, like companies could say, I'm going to rely on open source storage formats like Iceberg, but I'm going to run compute. Like I'm going to pick and choose the compute I want to use. So I might want to use Snowflake to run my queries and then, store the results back onto S3. Or I may use Databricks and Spark to run the data or to run the jobs. So like I think there's something there, and like another example here I heard, which I really liked, I haven't really thought about it too much, was small jobs, small amounts of data, you could use DuckDB and do it locally. Medium-sized jobs use a data warehouse. Large jobs use GPUs. So there's like a lot of interesting things there, right? Where maybe if you really do think about SQL itself as a commodity layer, then you just pick the runtime or the computation engine you want based on your requirements, whether it's like size of the data or performance or cost. Let me check the comments on LinkedIn to see if anyone left anything on there. Nothing yet. Okay, cool. I'm glad I have about 10 minutes left here, so I'm glad to go over some of the themes and thoughts I got from the Data Council conference that I was at last week. So, a bit of context. I was there from Monday afternoon to yesterday evening. It's 3 days in Austin, and the way it was structured is there are keynotes, like two keynotes a day, where everyone's invited, right? It's a big auditorium, big section, and then there's three tracks each day, so three different tracks each day. So across 3 days, it was nine total tracks, and the tracks span anything from like data engineering to data streaming, data culture, lots of AI. Some were like LLM focused, others were focused, more on like GPUs and like that sort of idea. And so I met a ton of different people. It was very technical, which I liked, rather than being like more commercial. But of course, there were questions about culture, and I recommend it. So if anyone has a chance to go, definitely go. I think it's annual and in Austin. There was also a ton of happy hours, so you got to meet, with people that are actually using the tools, working on these tools. And everyone has pretty, you talk to engineers and you'll end up inevitably discover that everyone has pretty strong opinions. The sessions are also going to be recorded or were recorded, so they should be up in the next week or two, from what I heard. And there's a schedule up, so if you go to like datacouncil.ai, there's a link to the schedule, so you could actually see some of the sessions that may be worth watching when they're posted on, I believe, YouTube. Yes, Isaac, I will post them. Like after this call, I'll post them. So few themes that stood out to me. One, open source is big. So, and there's quite a lot happening here. I spoke earlier about Iceberg, right? How Iceberg seems to be very dominant right now for storage. Like even for example, like Snowflake's adopting it. I'm sure it's damaging to Snowflake because they make money on storing data in Snowflake, yet they have enough customer demand, customer interest that they're forced to support this like open storage format. Um, the other one, Hootie, all seems to be popular. There's even a company called I think I forgot the name, like One. I don't remember the name. I don't want to butcher it, but they basically built an entire like ecosystem stack all around Hootie. The other big topic was Arrow, so it's like an in-memory format, right? So you could access like pretty like columnar data like for design for analytics in a variety of different languages, but it's still all using the same sort of in-memory format. And there was quite a lot around, I would say, like these tools that are trying to make SQL dialect lists, right? Basically, like trying to remove the dialect from SQL. So the example, like we spoke about SQL a lot before, there's also a tool called like IBIS, another tool called Substrate that really, in my mind, like all fit together with this idea of like, does SQL really need to have like dialect at all? Other theme that stood out for me was just the wide range of companies and life cycles. And I think it goes back to a previous question, you know, that like I think yeah, Brian asked around just like what I've seen. And it goes back to, I think, the echo chamber, right? We're like, my sense is like we're just very early here. It seems that we're mature and there's everything going on, but there's still so much to figure out. Because like really, like these large Fortune 500 companies like are really just starting down their data journey. And now everything's turned, blowing up again because of AI and how people take advantage of it. There was a point someone made in a talk of how, companies were in this world of, hey, I have all this data in my data center. I'm gonna go shift it all to the cloud in order to take advantage of, internet scale and on-demand compute and so forth. And now with the rise of AI, companies are being like, hey, actually, I can't afford cloud anymore given how much data I have. So now they're shifting it back to the data center, saying, I'd rather, have my own GPUs, have my own like massive amounts of data. So like it's interesting. There's like we're for sure very early here, and we are all gonna have to figure out like see how it plays out. Another thought was this conflict between closed source and open source. We spoke about Snowflake, and there's a lot of and Databricks versus like completely open source solutions. And I don't know, it's a bit of a mix. Like I've spoken with, a variety of like very intelligent people, like very accomplished, and some are, I sold all my Snowflake stock because I don't think they're in on AI. They don't know what they're doing. Someone else says, you know what? Actually, Snowflake makes things so easy, like no one else is gonna like succeed at all. Like Snowflake still wins, even if they have to store the data elsewhere. And maybe some other ones are all about, I'm gonna take advantage of open source, and I don't trust any of these proprietary vendors. And you do find that in like some larger companies do tend to be much more protective of their data, and like they will willingly either like use open source and incur the cost, of hosting everything themselves, or even write their own frameworks, write their own languages, just to not rely on what's already been built. And yeah, obviously the last one, yeah, the second to last one was mentioned before, like how SQL is a commodity, and you could then maybe figure out the optimal compute level, whether it's DuckDB for local, data warehouse, or GPUs, and wouldn't be 2024 without AI. So like a few things here, like I'm not an AI expert by means, so I don't want to, say like sort of misrepresented. But one theme that was interesting to me was people just think about AI separately from data science and ML, and that was odd to me because I came up from this world where I view AI as like a subset of data science and ML as a way of like productionalizing it all. So I don't know. The fact that people think about it differently, like, was just interesting to me. I can't even put a finger on it. The other point was just around the value of good data, and how good data could replace volume of data. It makes like models themselves, much more accurate, easier to train, meaning it's going to be faster to train them, require less data. But on the flip side, might be that at scale in the long term, as AI gets better and better and better, it'll just be able to handle like all of this mess anyway. So maybe it's not a problem. And there was also a lot of different focus on, just the different parts of the AI stack, right? Like there are some things that are much more like hardware specific. Like, is there a way of writing different, languages, or disrupting CUDA and like NVIDIA's monopoly? Some other ones were more practical, like how do I measure the performance and quality of an LLM? Like, we have pretty good ways of testing, unit testing our code and making sure that when we deploy features, they work well. But how do you do that for a prompt? How do you compare prompt A versus prompt B? And then the other elements were more about tooling. So I met the creator of Hamilton. It's like this library that makes it easy to create like ML pipelines, ML jobs. And there was quite a lot of conversations around embeddings and vector databases, like just the different types of tools you can build there. And so I see one more question from Isaac. What about converters or enrichers to from graph database and SQL? And you get tools that can move between the two that could be good to bridge something into LLMs. I don't know much here, because I know, yeah, I don't have a good sense here, Isaac. Like, what do you mean by this one? Is it like a way of, I guess, like generating embeddings?
Well,
Because
in theory, your graph database is set up. for the knowledge graph and have connections and a lot more metadata. And then SQL's just plain tabular. And then the the converting between the two, or trying to make the AIs of the world learn from one or the other, you have to have, I think, both in place
Mm.
at some level. I'm just curious if there are any existing tools you're aware of
I
that
don't know much.
handle.
You probably know more about this, but I do. I did run into a company. Maybe, oftentimes it's like you discover, you see something similar and it acts as inspiration. So one company I came across and I met someone from a company called Featrix. It's like Featrix.ai. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to do embeddings on top of tabular data. So it's not the same, right? It's like obviously transition to like a graph. But the point there, and it sort of resonated with me because like my former job, we were in advertising, and we would try to create models that would calculate click-through rate as a function of browser and operating system and device with these like very categorical variables. And there's something to it about being able to say, hey, actually, what what could we like? Could we embed, let's say, a particular ad request, right? Like everything about someone looking at an ad on a web page, and then using that instead of like the structured data of like browser and OS, having an embedding generated and basically like fitting regression on top of that. And I thought there was something cool, something interesting there, but it's like beyond my knowledge level, so that's why I can't speak about it too well. Like the company we used also in Triplift, and at the time I was leaving, like they were sort of talking about like like we're using the company was called Aerospike, and initially started as like a very fast key value lookup similar to DynamoDB, but at the time I left, they were talking about how they're gonna doing much more investment like graph databases. So I don't know if that's something there. It's a pretty heavy like product though in the sense of like you don't run it in like a small cluster. It tends to be like much larger scale, but. Yeah, maybe one way of thinking about it is if performance isn't a factor, you could also use like S3 as this neutral storage where you dump the data into a variety of different formats, and you could see if any of them end up being, useful, for like basically like you have multiple projections of the same data, and then you figure out based on the consumer, they'll choose the optimal one to use. I don't know, what do you know about like potential tools here?
Well, I I'm looking at Aerospike currently, and no, the graph as a like scalability, it's less scalable than SQLs. That's something they're working on. And I know that there are some companies like data.world that have tried to bridge the SQL to Sparkle or graph based language divide. And I'm pretty sure they're releasing a lot of AI stuff. And the
Yeah.
idea is, throughout the the metaverse, you have lots and lots of SQL that you could learn from.
Yeah.
And instead of focusing on, let's say, a single company, you try to make it more generic and apply similar principles uh, that are out there, but do it the right way, if you will. Kind of have uh, a single way. We always say a single source of truth, and then ask them for the sequel behind their truth. Is usually the second part of that, because everybody's truth is a little different.
Yeah. Yeah, I think SQL has this tendency to not be very easy. It sounds easy, right? But then everyone has a very different version of it.
Right. Everybody writes different.
That's yeah. I don't know. There's probably something there. I mean, people make the claim, right, that in order to make AI truly useful, you want to, data quality, data quality, data quality. But someone, what's his name, like, like, what's it called, Ben Stansel, he made a point over the like the past week that maybe at scale AI is going to handle all this complexity anyway, right? So right now we care about quality, but a year from now, 2 years from now, we're not going to worry anyway because the AI will be smart enough to figure out, sort of get all the signal through the noise. Like who knows? But cool. Well, thank you everyone for another session. I'll see everyone in 2 weeks, and this recording should be up, and let me post actually, like Isaac, I'll post the link to this data council schedule on the Zoom and on the LinkedIn post.